Good afternoon. Welcome to this webinar on the Latinx vote and its importance to the outcome of the November election. My name is Leonore Ailing, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for California Studies at Sac State. The center is sponsoring this event as part of its celebration of Hispanic Heritage Month. And we're glad you could join us for this important discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Roxy Hernandez. She's the Director of Legis School and a proud Sac State graduate. She'll be helping us. We'll be running the webinar. We'll be behind the scenes. And before we hear from our distinguished panel, I'd like to express my appreciation to President Robert Nelson, as the president of Sac State, for his support of the center and for agreeing to appear today and give some words of welcome. President Nelson.
Thank you, Leonore. As California's capital university, I'm proud to be with you and to join with you on this important day. This is the Hispanic Heritage Month, and we are proud to be a Latinx serving institution. We are proud to be able to be part of this. The election is going to be pivotal, and the Latinx population is going to make a difference in that election. I want to thank the Center for California Studies for bringing us together to have this opportunity. And I want to thank everyone who is here today that is involved, that cares, that wants to be involved in what we're trying to do. Sac State has over 34% of our students who are Latinx. 34%, okay, out of 30,000 students. You can do the math and you know where we're at. That's 9,000 students plus, okay? And what can we say about them? They are graduating, and they're graduating on time, and they're graduating at the same rate as our Anglo students are graduating. That makes me even more proud for what we're trying to do here. So it's fitting that Sac State is hosting this event. It's the right thing to do. We are here as an anchor institution promoting civic engagement, and I really am glad to see this event happening. And as always, stingers up.
Thank you, President Nelson. Before I introduce our moderator, I want to acknowledge Sacramento City Council member Eric Guerra, who's here today and who will give some closing remarks.
No, thank you very much, Lenore. Glad to chat at the end of our program. Excited to be here. Stingers up, go Hornets, and great to see all you out here today.
Thank you. So our moderator is Christopher Cabaldon, who joined Sac State in May of 2019 as the first Hazel Kramer Endowed Chair in the Department of Public Policy and Administration. He brings many years of experience in state and local government, having served as the Vice Chancellor of the California Community Colleges and in various state and federal appointments. And he's also the mayor of West Sacramento. Became the first mayor directly elected by West Sacramento voters in November 2004, excuse me. And prior to that, he served on the City Council for 10 years. He's active in the U.S. Conference of Mayors, among other national endeavors. Take it away, Chris. Thank you.
Well, Leonore, thank you so much. And thanks to everybody for joining us today. The topic is so relevant and so important, but we have really some of the most insightful national thinkers and actors around the topic today, from here in California and here on campus at Sac State all the way to San Antonio, Texas, but really to think about both action and thinking, research and practice, and the results, obviously, of the election itself. And we're going to be tackling this in a conversational talk show style format, but talk show rooted in data and evidence and in real insight. And we've got a really fantastic panel. So I want to, let's introduce them. Let's meet who we've got with us today. Starting with Cristina Flores-Victor, who is an assistant professor here at Sac State in the Department of Political Science, and is one of the rising stars around the country in this topic area, and has done extensive research around voting patterns and the Latinx vote as part of her broader research program, but really with a lot of attention to attribution and attribution theory, to emotion, to the assignment of responsibility and to discrimination and how it's and not just how it's experienced, but also how it's perceived and how that relates to politics. So we're really going to benefit a lot from rooting ourselves in some of the research topics that are hot in this field and understanding some of the stories and the issues and the themes behind what we're seeing on the national circuit and in the media. And speaking of the national circuit and the media, we're really excited to be joined by Mike Madrid. Mike is a national celebrity on this topic and has been for quite a while. It was 20 years ago that I remember seeing both Mike and Laura, our next panelist in a moment, on C-SPAN and so many other places talking about the upcoming rise of the Latinx electorate and what it meant and the lessons in California from Proposition 187 and the changes here in the political landscape that both of them, particularly Mike, has written quite a bit about, spoken quite a bit about, but was there and has been there through the evolution, the ups and downs, and the transformation of California's political climate. But now he's world famous for his leadership role at the Lincoln Project as one of the co-founders and leaders of the Lincoln Project, which in some ways might be one of the most exciting new developments in the 2020 election in terms of its impact. And we'll hear more about the work of the Lincoln Project and as it relates here in just a moment from Mike, but really extraordinarily grateful to him for joining us as well. And then finally, Laura Barberena, who is a political consultant. Mike does a little bit of that too, but Laura's gonna kind of call us on our little bubble issues and remind us that there's more to the world than just Sacramento, more than just California, and more to the Latinx electorates than just what we perceive here in California. She's also gonna give us some perspective historically and from her work on the ground as somebody working campaigns, like literally working campaigns right now in the car as she's driving around, probably delivering lawn signs or what have you. But Laura is one of the most influential and important communication media and political consultants in the San Antonio area and more broadly around the country. So what a powerhouse panel that we have.
One on the men's and one on the women.
Mike, can you lead us off since you're in the knockdown drag out right now, Mike, with respect to the national election, and where do we sit at the moment with the role and the perspectives, the numbers, the battleground states? Where are we in terms of the Latinx vote or the Latinx electorates with an S, and what it might mean for the upcoming election?
First, let me say thank you to Sacramento State for hosting this and putting this together. It's really a great opportunity. For those of you that don't know, I first met Mayor Cabaldon many years ago when he was a vice chancellor of the community college system and was a fierce advocate of helping Latinos and the Latinx community access higher educational opportunities. So it was really kind of an inspiration, and it's great to see him here today. It's also an honor to be with two strong Latinos who are very involved in the field, both as academics and as practitioners. So I'm honored to be here with this group. Look, we have been saying for 30 plus years that Latinos would be the sleeping giant would awaken, and somehow our voice would be heard as the largest fastest growing segment of the electorate. This time, I think it's probably actually going to materialize. For 30 years, we've been waiting for it to happen, and it hasn't quite happened. But because in 2020, Latinos, Hispanics, Latinx community will surpass the African American vote as the second largest ethnic voting group in America, and because of the states where we are most represented, specifically Florida, Arizona, and increasingly Texas as a battleground state, there's no question that Latinx turnout is going to be definitive in determining who will be the next president of the United States. So again, it's not just that we are growing and that we are going to become the second largest ethnic group in America voting for the first time in history. It's also the states that we are putting into play because of our presence. We are certainly large throughout the Sun Belt, as I mentioned, in Florida, Texas, and Arizona, but we're also working on targeting and identifying Hispanic voters in Pennsylvania and North and South Carolina and Georgia. There are pockets of Latino voters in virtually every state in America, with very few exceptions, all of whom are targetable, reachable, and looking to be activated and engaged. I'm sure through the course of the conversation today, we'll talk about some of those nuances between our Cuban, Colombian, Venezuelan, Mexicano brothers and sisters that need to be engaged in unique and different ways. But as a table setter, I'd just like to say, this is going to be that year. It's exciting to watch, to see it unfold for those of us that have been doing it for many years, studying it for many years, and involved in communities throughout the country. I'm excited about what's going to happen in 3 short weeks, and I believe it's going to bring us to the table, the American table, in a way that we have perhaps been remiss at being seated at for far, far too long. So thank you, Chris.
Great. Thanks for leading us off, Mike. That's fantastic. So Dr. Flores-Victor, and I may not get a chance to, I want to thank Christina directly. When I first came to Sac State, she's been my mentor in effective teaching and pedagogy and project-based learning. So thank you so much for living out your commitment to lifting folks up, particularly in the Latinx community, through effective teaching too. But I want to turn to you about this question, because Mike talked about the sleeping giant, and but also kind of gave us some insight into, we're not talking about one giant, that we're talking about a diverse community within the Latinx construct. And so you've done a lot of research around thinking about how different kinds of Latino voters and Latinx residents think about their own experience of discrimination, for example, and then how that might relate to political messaging. Do I see myself when I see a candidate talk about demonizing Latinx folks or not? Do I see myself in that or not? And so I'm curious if you can start to give us some insights and get some scholarly grounding in the questions that we're taking up right now around what are some of the things that we may not know or that we shouldn't take for granted as we think about the upcoming election and the Latinx electorates?
Yeah, wow, that was an amazing question. There were lots of questions in there. I will do my best to try and give us some insight. I do have research with some co-authors from UC Davis who we looked at this question, because as we all know, especially those on this panel, Latinos are not a monolithic group, right? They don't all vote the same. They don't have the same preferences. And as Mike already kind of mentioned, we have Cubans and Puerto Ricans in Florida, we have Central Americans and South Americans and Mexicanos, right? And so it's not a monolithic group. And even within the group, so let's say we were only looking at Mexican Americans, there's first, second, and third generation, right? There are people who live in mixed status families. So how does this kind of all work together? And some of the research that I have worked on has looked at perceptions of discrimination and how does that kind of change how people participate politically. And one of the things we looked at was whether or not citizenship had an impact on kind of the perception of discrimination. And what we saw in our research, looking over the 10 years in the 2000s, kind of leading up to this moment where we're at right now, is that we saw that there wasn't actually a lot of difference across the generations. You might think that first generation immigrants who are Spanish speaking might be, and they are, the closest to kind of discrimination because of language ability or because maybe the jobs they're in or they don't have the benefit of citizenship. But we actually find that as kind of we move through the 2000s in this period of like kind of increasingly demonizing immigration and tying Latinos to the immigration topic, and we find that this gap between kind of citizens and non-citizens in the perception of discrimination gets smaller and smaller and smaller over time, right? And so as a group, we do kind of start to become stigmatized, right? And we take on the attributes of the stigmatized group. So to your question of how does this kind of, in a way, Latinos are separate groups, right? They come from different places, they have different experiences, they've been here different lengths of time. But also within this political context, we can start to see that people are seeing themselves as part of the same group, right? And having the same experiences, having the same kind of experiences, especially with discrimination. And that starts to kind of change people's patterns of political participation, trust in the government, how they see representation and issues of representation in their community. So I do want to say on the one hand, there's lots of different types of Latinos and we are not all one type of group and we don't all have the same political preferences. And on the other hand, there are these experiences that we are having that kind of do start to, I guess, increase our ability to identify with this kind of pan-ethnic, we are all Latinos and we're kind of all in this together. So I guess a bit of both is happening right now.
Well, welcome to a university panel, because we've just had our first on the one hand, on the other hand, which is really the essence of what this inquiry is all about. Now, what I found, one of the things I found fascinating about that particular study that you're referencing is that what you found was that the actual experience, reported experience of discrimination was fairly constant, but the perception about discrimination was related to could be more related to other attributes and other factors. And in a lot of ways, that's what it seems like. That's what we saw in California in the Prop 187 period and aftermath, where it was the rise of the assignment of the experience of discrimination that people were perceiving in society and in government and frankly by political parties, that didn't necessarily correlate with their own individual experience, that radically transformed politics in a way. And so I'm wondering, if I can turn back to you, Mike, whether your lessons through that experience, how they're influencing and shaping the strategies of the Lincoln Project and what you're seeing at the national level.
Yeah, look, that's a really great question, and it was fascinating listening to the professor kind of set the table there, because, and look, this is probably just because I'm the old guy here on the panel, but prior to 1994, what we did see was very marked partisan generational differences. What we would see is first and second generation Mexican Americans, specifically because the sample sizes were so large that we could actually gauge them, or they were large enough, I should say. By the third generation, what you would see is an assimilative move into a representation in the party structure that looked like the overall mainstream society. That changed dramatically in 1994 with Proposition 187, and it created a multi-generational, multi-ethnic, multi-class, multi-gender coalition where it never really existed before. And so in many ways, the question that really a lot of us were asking, both as practitioners and then looking for academics in their research, was will Latinos, continue on this assimilative path, right? Very similar to what Italians or the Poles or even Jewish groups looked like after 3 generations of a melting pot in America, or would we take on a more of an aggrieved racial minority path? And curiously, at this moment in time, there seems to be this inflection point where we are witnessing kind of a hybrid of both of those. There is this incredible diversity that the professor was speaking about, with one exception, is we vote largely as a block, and have actually, frankly, for some time. Now, there are some chips in that, and that, now to your question specifically, there are some differences that we are beginning to see, most specifically with one group, the Cuban American group in South Florida, Miami-Dade area, which has really been motivated and charged by kind of the Trump administration's anti-socialist message. It has created a multi-generational block, or at least a block is probably too generous, a bump in support, especially amongst young Cubans who really don't have that same passionate anti-Castro, anti-communist sentiment that their grandparents or even their parents had. That seems to be shifting a little bit more towards a more, and again, block is probably too generous, but at least a multi-generational coalition of Cubans. Perhaps more distressing is seeing U.S.-born Hispanic men are beginning to vote a little bit more Trumpy, as I call it. They're a little bit more inclined to be supporting some of the political rhetoric that I think has troubled every other segment of the community. And so as a Lincoln Project, what we have focused on specifically is working to kind of limit and contain the growth of that kind of sentiment for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is we think it's necessary from a numbers perspective to actually win the race, but to bring in kind of a Cuban perspective, a Cuban messaging, especially multi-generational, but skewing younger, to peel them off, and then also to kind of focus with very small slices of the electorate, looking at Mexican-American men, U.S.-born throughout the Sunbelt states, has really allowed us to, I think, take the sophistication level of our targeting with the Latinx community to a whole different level. It's exciting as a practitioner, been kind of waiting 30 years to have this much diversity in the community. It's troubling as a Latino and as an American to see kind of segments of the community being attracted to certain messages that many of us find troubling.
Right. Well, Laura, Mike kind of called you out. He mentioned the Sun Belt, and I'm gonna consider that a point of personal privilege. Can we bring you into the conversation? I don't know if you're still on video, and I know you're driving from campaign stop to campaign stop, Laura, out in San Antonio. But can you give it and Texas doesn't have the same history that we have in California that we just explored a little bit with both with Christina and Mike. Can you give us a sense of what the picture, both in Texas and the rest of the Sun Belt, and as you're seeing in the rest of the country, what that looks like? And particularly in your background, I mean, you're of the four of us, you're the one on the streets working on ballot initiatives and candidates for school boards and everything else. How are you seeing the relationship of the rest of the election, including the presidential, but not just the presidential, in terms of Latino voting patterns in Texas and beyond? Oh, you've gotten out of the car. Looks like we may have a connection problem between California and Texas, not for the first time. So we may return to Laura in just a moment. Can I ask you? So Mike, you also teed up the issue of gender very directly. Oh, Laura, I see you back. Did you get a chance to hear the question?
There we go. I'm back on. Yay!
Welcome.
Welcome. Sorry about that. That's we are in the middle of an election here, probably the most significant and most important one, certainly in our lifetime. So thank you guys for your patience, and thank you for having me. I kind of caught the question, but I was sort of trying to rush into my office. But if you don't mind, just teeing me up again, and I'll be happy to.
Maybe the simplest way is to say, tell us something that us Californians wouldn't know about Latinx voting and the election. Give us some perspective from outside of our Golden State bubble.
Well, out of the Golden State bubble, there's a lot of excitement happening here in Texas, at least where I'm coming from. A lot of excitement. We have an incredible amount of turnout. People kept saying, is this the year where Texas is going to turn blue? Is this the year? And of course, we've been waiting for that to happen for quite some time. And, I really think it will take sort of the perfect storm for that to happen here in Texas. And of course, if Texas goes blue, it sort of changes national politics forever as the way we look at it. But there's a lot of things happening, sort of these key elements that I think contribute to what we would call the perfect storm here in Texas that could flip the state. So one, I think we have what we can all agree is an unpopular incumbent. And that is something that can really affect our ability to get voters to come out. Number two, we see key groups of the electorate that he once had starting to drop off. So where he once had strong support among seniors, we just don't see that. White suburban women starting to leave him as well. So that's, again, another element to that perfect storm. And then here in Texas, we're seeing high enthusiasm. I don't know what's going on in California, but I can tell you here in Texas, crazy. We're seeing lines like I have never seen before. I mean, me dio escalofrío, day one. There's a library right around the corner from my home. And it's where I often go to kind of check the pulse on things. It's one of those polls that both Democrats and Republicans go to. I got there at probably around a little bit before 8 o'clock in the morning. The polls opened at 8. The line snuck all the way around the building. And that was true in several of our voting places here in San Antonio. And it was just, I mean, literally it gave me escalofrío. Like I started to almost tear up because I thought, yes, democracy. Like, you just don't see that level of enthusiasm, and we're really, really feeling that. And then finally, money. We keep talking about the Latino, the sleeping giant, blah, blah, blah. It's like, we're not asleep. We're wide awake. We just, it's just, there are these structural things that just keep us from participating in the ways that we should. Latino Decisions, who I partner with on a lot of the work that I do, and I do a lot of, they talked about what are the differences between California and Texas? What is that distinction? And as it turns out, we have the same levels of enthusiasm. We have all the things, it's just we can't get our vote counted. A lot of people don't know this, but number one, you have to be registered 30 days before the election. We don't get sent a mail ballot unless you're 65 or over or disabled, or out of the country. So when you think about just the simple things of getting your vote counted, there's so many structural things that keep us. And here in Texas, we've become sort of immune, like we're so used to it that we don't even question it anymore. Like the idea that you could be registered to vote one day and then not be able to the next day, it makes you feel as if, so 30 days before the election, we're all citizens and have the ability to register to vote. But then the next day, suddenly I've lost all my rights as a citizen to be able to participate in an election. But we've gotten so used to it, we don't question it anymore. And it's really sad. And one of the things that you've seen here in Texas, and you all might have read about it in the news, because of what's happening with the Postal Service, a lot of people who have decided to vote by mail are scared to put their mail ballots in the mail. Here in San Antonio, for instance, they shut down 2 of our sorting machines. So people are like, well, I want to go turn my ballot in, right? A mano. Voy a ir a dejarlo en mi mano, right? Well, the law, Texas law, only allows 1 box per county. So 1 box per county where you can actually go and drop off your ballot, but you have to have a photo ID and blah, blah, blah. I mean, there's all these structural things, but nonetheless, you're creating all these problems that are keeping Latinos from exercising their vote and really kind of creating this great storm that we have. I like to think that, I was doing some work for Southwest Voter Registration Education Project, and we were doing some stuff for Arizona, and I'm like, oh my God, you can register online? What's that? Mind blown. Like, you can't do that in Texas. You can't register to vote online. So there's just a lot of structural things that are keeping us from reaching our full potential. And, the sleeping giant has been wide awake, and, we've been walking around, stretching our legs and doing all those things. We've just been locked in, both figuratively and quite literally, in a cage. And so, I think this election has all the elements of the perfect storm, and we don't really have to do that much. We just got to get those 400 plus new Latinos who've become eligible to vote, who've now turned 18 since 2016. 400,000 Latinos can now be eligible to vote. Can you imagine if we got them to vote? We would have a significant impact, not just on, local elections, but in, certainly in this big national election.
Great, thanks, Laura. And you, now that you mentioned the drop boxes, just a shameless plug. We have a drop box at Sac State at the Well. So we have as many as they have for the entire county serving San Antonio. So there's no reason why we can't all vote here, at least in the greater Sacramento region with our anchor university. So Mike, you teed up the question of gender, and we're seeing a very large gap between Latinos and Latinas in this election. And we're also seeing a very large gap between men and women of all backgrounds. And so I want to ask you, and then also ask Christina for your take on what are the numbers telling us, what are the trends telling us, and what should we know? What are some of the myths about the gender gap, and what are some realities we should be aware of?
Mr. Mayor, it's a really great question. I actually was working with Jennifer Medina, a New York Times reporter, on this. She wrote a great story on it just yesterday. This gap, this gender gap, is bigger than it ever has been in the history of modern polling, certainly with Latinos, Latinas, including U.S. born. The question is really one of why. And I think there's 2 reasons why. The first, and we don't have enough data to really understand this, but I think it's a fair assumption to make, is Latinas actually have a higher college attendance and graduation rate than Latinos do. And we believe that there's a correlation between how educated you are, whether or not you have a college degree, college education, and how much you're moving away from the Republican Party at this point. So that seems the first obvious correlation, is our educational attainment matters, not just as Latinos, but as Americans, but it's appearing within the data subsets with Latinas and Latinos, that differential. The second, of course, is let me set this up by saying Donald Trump's base of support, his strongest base of support, is non-college educated white males. As blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt states that don't feel a whole lot of economic opportunity. It's not an aspirational vote. There's a lot of that same economic anxiety with US born Hispanic males that also lack a college degree. So this economic populist argument, again, troubling as it may be, seems to, at least in the data, suggest that there is some stickiness with that message with men from our community, young US born men. The good news is from both practical campaign experience and from research and testing, we've been able to move a lot of those Latinos back into kind of a more traditional voting pattern when we start to communicate on the dangers and the threats to the community at large. So there's, I think, an initial appeal that is very similar to white cohorts and white counterparts, but they do come back once we spend the resources and move them back with a cultural appeal in a way that is a little bit more comforting. But again, most specifically to the question, we believe very strongly that there's a direct correlation between college level attainment that is exacerbating the gender gap politically.
Christine, as we turn to you, I just want to, for all of our participants that are joining us this afternoon, if you've got a question that you'd like to ask of any or all of the panel, please just type it in the Q&A, and we will get to participant questions shortly, but take it away. So Christina, this gender question, if you can give us some insights, and then I have a follow-up for you too.
Oh, great. Well, yeah, as Mike said, I mean, this is the gender gap across, especially states that we're really interested in. Like he's already mentioned North Carolina, Texas, Arizona. The gender gap is between, like 14 and over 20 in some of these states. And as he mentioned, it's the highest between kind of rural Latino men and rural Latinas. And so why is that? I do agree that the fastest growing group of eligible and registered voters are younger Latinas. Maybe a little bit of caution that we, as people interested in politics, a word of caution is that historically in previous presidential elections, though, even though that group is growing and registering and is very motivated, it has had almost 10% lower turnout compared to Black women and white women in presidential elections. So I think that we should be excited and we should do outreach to that group. And if they're registering, and we should be encouraging them to vote. But I do worry a little bit about this kind of persistent lower turnout for Latinas in presidential elections than other women's groups. And I will say possibly one more thing that might be kind of driving this gender gap among Latinos is that Latinas in recent surveys done, over the summer and especially now leading up to the Supreme Court nomination have really strong preferences for kind of reproductive rights and choice over their own personal decisions for reproductive rights. So I think the last poll I saw was somewhere for Nevada, North Carolina, Colorado, some of these states, it's in the high 70s for believing that this is like a fundamental kind of human right to have autonomy over these choices. And so some of this kind of late swing or this increase in the younger kind of Latinas might be tied to this issue of kind of seeing the current administration as being hostile to these types of rights, and also kind of tied into the Affordable Care Act and other kind of things like that too. But that could be one potential policy issue that's driving kind of younger Latinas more towards the Democratic Party than the Republican Party.
That's really interesting. And so I wonder if you might also weigh in, since you're counseling us to pay attention to the actual experience, perception, psychology of various Latino electorates. Racial justice has been a key topic nationally, certainly here locally as well, but nationally. And so for those of us that are in the college or university community, it feels very clear. Like there's now a multiracial coalition. We're going to have an intersectional campaign for justice. How do we know? Is there data? Is there research that's giving us some sense of like how are different Latino constituencies processing that issue? Is it a motivator? Or given some of the economic issues that you were describing, Mike, does it play both ways? I mean, how is one of the top issues of 2020 really playing out inside Latino electorates, if we know?
Well, I'll give a quick answer. The other two might have a more detailed answer. Is in recent polls, it has moved up on the list. So when they're asking people, what's the most important thing to you in this election, most of the polls, and I could be wrong about not all of them, but COVID is very high, right? Healthcare, COVID, jobs are at the top. For some Latino groups, immigration sometimes is around number four or five, right? Depending on their ordering. And in the most recent polls I've looked at, the issue of racial justice has now kind of moved up into like the top five for some people and some groups. And I would say, just to kind of plug some of my own research too, is that I do think that minority groups, they see themselves as kind of these co-ethnic groups, right? Even if they're from different kind of minority groups, there is this kind of coalition. If somebody else is on the ballot, maybe there's not a Latino on the ballot, but there might be, a Black woman or a Black man, this kind of solidarity between minority groups. So I've done some work with another professor at Sac State, Danielle Martin, where we looked at this kind of thing, like, do these appeals work, right? So if they're not coming from someone in your racial or ethnic group, but someone else is making them, it does increase the favorability or the preference for that type of candidate or those types of policies. And so we could be seeing that kind of slowly building momentum as we get toward the election. But I do think that it's increased in salience for the Latino kind of electorate and registered voters, whereas, several months ago, I don't think it was kind of that high on their preference list of kind of like national issues that they cared about.
Yeah, and I'll chime in right now. I think also that's just not happening as an anomaly. I think you're seeing serious investment being made into communities around these issues of social justice. So folks like George Soros, who are investing heavily in candidates. One of my candidates here, in fact, the district attorney here in San Antonio, reaped the benefits of some of that investment. So, that's also part of it too, is that, it does take sending out these messages and making these relevant. I think the pandemic is huge, especially among women and minority women, because I think the pandemic has caused them to, so many of them are in service industry jobs, and certainly here in Texas, and I know in other states, the whole hotel industry, hospitality industry has just tanked. And so you're seeing a lot of women losing their jobs. And when you lose your job and you're sitting at home, you have a lot of time to think. And you think about what matters. You think about what it means to put food on your table. You think about what's important to you. And I've always said this, and when I was working on my academic career and when I was going through my PhD program, I remember telling someone, wow, what a luxury it is to just think. Right? To have the time to just sit and think about things, to think about what you care about and what matters. And so I think what's happening is this pandemic has made everyone just stop and think. And I think that's had a profound impact, especially on women.
Great. I'm going to make a pitch again for questions. I recognize a lot of folks from the Sac State community, the Capital community, and others that are in part of our webinar today, so I know that you've heard at least one thing that you don't agree with, or that you have more questions about. Be sure to put it in the Q&A, and we'll make sure our panel gets a chance to address it as well. So you both, Laura and Christina, both just emphasized COVID and the COVID-19 as an issue. I'm also curious about it in terms of turnout and vote dynamics and the changes to voting systems that are occurring all around the country. I know in our own region that in most counties, the positivity rates among Latino residents are 2-3 times higher than for the overall population, whether that's in Sacramento or Yolo or Yuba or Sutter. 20-25% positive rates when we're shooting. We're supposed to be at 4%, which means higher case rates. Also means higher levels of quarantine. And restrictions on your ability to exit to go to a vote center and all of that. So, Mike, if we turn to you for a moment. So, both on COVID, the issue, like as it presents in Latino voters' minds, but then COVID, just the straight up restriction on your ability to move or even to focus on things other than getting food on the table or paying rent. What are some of the implications for Latino electorates in November?
So look, that's a really fascinating question. And the truth is nobody knows because this is a unique environment. But there are some things that we do know that can kind of lead us down the path to greater understanding. You articulated perfectly that Latinos are disproportionately impacted by COVID, both infection and death rates as a percentage of the population. And was said earlier too, we are also the essential workers of the American economy. And unfortunately, our policymakers in Washington, D.C. have not treated us like essential human beings. So there's greater exposure to COVID. And so not only are we dying and getting infected and more unhealthy because of the pandemic, we are also more economically devastated with the consequences that are reaped by it. The question then ultimately becomes, what does that mean in terms of civic engagement and civic behavior? Well, what we do know is this. Latinos do have, as the professor pointed out, the lowest voter participation rate of any of the 4 major ethnicities, not just in California, but nationwide. So we've got a turnouts challenge anyway, right? Civic engagement is a little bit more challenging for us as a community. We also have the lowest rates of vote by mail. We are increasingly and almost always have been both a late deciding community, in other words, as lower information voters, as people who are working 2 and 3 jobs, as those essential workers that make the economy hum. We do not have, as was just said, the luxury of taking time to think about our voting decisions the way other ethnic and racial groups do. That's just a fact. So we decide later. And we are also very much day of voters. We show up on election day by much wider numbers than any ethnic group also. So all of this combined does cause me some great concern. The health concerns of the pandemic, a lot of homes may be afflicted by this anyway. The eviction, we don't talk a lot about eviction rates or the loss of homes because of the loss of work. There's a direct correlation between not having a permanent address and not voting because of that as a result. So look, I do believe we are going to have a historic turnout with our community. I am troubled because I know that it would be much higher if we did not have the pandemic and if we were able to kind of more focus on traditional get out the vote efforts in an environment, a political environment that is so highly charged and highly focused and candidly highly targeted in our community, we would see even higher turnout rates. But again, I believe we're going to have high turnout rates. I don't think it will be as high as it could be because of the pandemic, but I think it will give us some lessons on how we can better improve civic engagement on all of these fronts going forward.
All right, Laura, let's go to you on the same topic then, since you're out there in your teams of volunteers and staff and whatever are out there just trying to get Graciela to turn in her ballot right that day.
Yeah.
What are you seeing in terms of like the real world on the streets and in the neighborhoods?
Well, I'm definitely seeing a lot of enthusiasm. I'm seeing a lot of grassroots community organizing that's not within sort of the structural systems that we're used to. So you see sort of these, in these world of like pop-up events, you see these pop-up organizations where people are popping up and organizing their own neighborhoods in a way that I've never quite seen before, creating voter kits. And there was a huge push, I've seen a huge push across the country for voter registration in a way that I've nearly not seen before, because people realize because of COVID, we have to figure out a way to do this. It's like the COVID is making us be much more creative and innovative. And as a result, I don't, again, as Mike said, we really don't know what this is like. And I always tell people, if a consultant is telling you they know, they're lying, because we don't know. There's just so much of the unknown. Is this a surge election? And what does a surge election mean for down ballot elections? Some of the things that have happened here in Texas, we can no longer straight ticket vote. So how does that affect the ability to continue to get people elected on a local level? But I will say this, you're seeing a lot of organization happening at a grassroots level that I've never really quite seen before. And it's not really being sparked by money. It's really being sparked by a desire to speak up. Social media has allowed people to just vomit on the computer in a way that's been both helpful and hurtful. But in some ways, I think it's really ignited people. I mean, yes, the memes make us laugh, and we could talk about the mosca all day. The mosca was just delightful. It was just delicious, the memes that came out of the mosca. But I really feel that creates people begin to talk and begin to organize and form little groups. And I'm seeing all these things sort of pop up that I've never quite seen before in an election. People realize what's at stake. they realize what's at stake. And that's a beautiful thing, because so many times when we're out talking to voters, trying to communicate the importance of an election, oh, you've got to go vote, you've got to go vote. And, their reaction is, ¿pa qué voy? A mí qué me importa? What does it matter to me, right? Now we're seeing the real effects of what an election can do to you, to your families, to your community, to the way we react to a pandemic, to your job, to unemployment. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. Like, people are really starting to see in a real way how their vote matters, right? And we've got to convince them. And here's the hard part, as Mike talks about these low information voters. I was actually at an event and a woman walked up to me and she says in Spanish, I've been a resident for 2 years. I don't know how to register to vote. Will you help me to register to vote? And I'm like freaking not deputized. I'm like, come over here. So I called someone to go get her registered. But when you have all this enthusiasm and all this excitement around the election and this realization of, yes, my vote matters, but at the end of the day, if they don't know how to make their vote count, we're just right back where we started. So, and understanding what you need to go to the polls. What does it take? When are they open? How do you get there? Transportation, right? How do you get there and have someone watch your kids? I don't want to take my kids to the voting site. There could get there's just so many things. And this is such an opportunity for us to, sort of close the deal, as I say. And they're there. We just gotta provide them with the information and instruction. First-time voters, they've never voted before. Both sides of the aisle, how the heck you get your ballot counted and your vote counted.
So, Christina, on this issue of COVID and Latino voters and Latino electorates, what are some of the things we should be looking out for? What are some of the questions that we might want to keep in mind? For students, for scholars, for journalists, and for citizens paying attention. What are some of the things? What are a couple of things that you're watching as we come up on the election itself? And you're muted still.
Of course, right? Of course. Had to do it at least once.
We all have to once.
One of the things I noticed, I just read the other day, a new poll came in, and I think it was just really fortuitous. Latino Decisions was in the field right when Trump announced his positive COVID diagnosis. And so I think one of the things possibly to watch as more polls roll in post his COVID diagnosis is their sample was pretty split pre him announcing and post. And the bump that he got with Latinos post his COVID announcing was significant. And so it was outside the margin of error. And so I think as we get closer to the election and more polls that were in the field around the same time start to come in, especially in these battleground states or Pennsylvania or North Carolina, Nevada, Arizona, wherever, I think that we should pay attention to see, like, not just post debate, but post this kind of whole COVID super spreader event that happened at the White House, like how that affects, because as I think both the other panelists mentioned, Latinos are late deciders. So they still have, kind of like between 6 and 13%, depending on what poll you look at, of undecided voters. And that's across the different Latino subgroups. So it's not just like a Mexican American thing. It's kind of across the different groups. We have large numbers of kind of late deciders. So I think as the election gets closer, that would be something that I would pay attention to, is how maybe his diagnosis impacts those late deciders as they come to the polls. And Chris, this doesn't completely answer your question, but as a political scientist, one thing that I would be interested in is, I've heard some people might call it, excuses about why the parties haven't done more to kind of do outreach to the Latino community, because we're still at a plurality of people when you poll them of saying that neither party has reached out to them. So no organizations or either party. And some of that in the current era right now, with maybe the Biden campaign specifically, has been that, well, we don't want to do outreach because of COVID, right? So we're not doing door knocking, we're not kind of doing events in the community, and we're doing different types of virtual outreach, which I believe, and I think that is true. But I would say as we move on from this election, one thing to kind of look at, because we are talking about Latinos as this like new group of voters that can swing elections in states, is how do the parties address that kind of outreach problem, right? it has to start back in the primaries. Voters have to feel like this is an authentic connection that they're making, right? There's not a lot of Latinos on the ballot, especially in kind of like the higher up congressional elections at the national level, right? So I think one of the things that I'd be most interested in this kind of post-COVID world is, what does outreach look like to these communities? Are we going to kind of continue to see the national parties, in my opinion, underperforming in their outreach to these communities? What does the outreach look like? Is it going to be, I guess, more varied in their policy outreach now that we see Latinos, they care about healthcare, they care about the COVID, they care about schools. Maybe the outreach will be something more than just like, well, here's something on immigration, because that must be kind of like the only topic that you care about. So I'm interested in the outcome of the election, of course, but I am also very interested in kind of what lessons we take from this COVID era and how we kind of move on and do outreach to the Latino community from here.
Great, thank you. Mike, can I ask you two kind of lightning questions, neither of which deserve a lightning answer, but they're going to have to get one,
Sure.
Based on some of the questions that have been posted by our attendees. So one is whether you've got any quick take on what the Amy Coney Barrett hearings and her nomination might mean for Latino voting turnout and or preferences. And then second, and the deeper one is, and Christina just mentioned the parties a few times. And we had one of the questions like, hey, is there ever going to be a Republican Party in California again that Latinos could be a part of, right? And you know, as I mean, we didn't put this in your intro, but you were probably the most important force, ultimately not that successful, but the most important force in trying to preserve a two-party system in California. At which voters of all backgrounds had a choice as one party was walking away. So I wonder if those two very quick questions might be something you might shed some insight on.
Yeah. I mean, you're exactly right on the latter. So you don't need to be delicate. I mean, I'm aware of it. I will say this. Look, at the Lincoln Project, we're watching, obviously, the news cycle very intensely and spending millions of dollars on messaging constantly. I'm not as convinced as I was a week ago that the Amy Barrett selection is going to be as decisive as I did maybe 10, 12 days ago. The reason why is we've already seen the significant shift that we were expecting in the last 7 to 10 days of voter opinion. There's so few decideds now at this point, and there's such strong motivation, and it's so stratified along partisan lines. I don't think that there's really any room for an October surprise. We'll see what happens, but I think everything that has broken has likely already solidified. There are already so many people voting that it's already moved into that traditional pattern. Open to criticism on that, but that's the way we're managing the strategic direction of the campaign from the Lincoln Project. Second point is, look, I'm not very optimistic that the Republican Party will ever return, not only to California. I think that it's following a trajectory nationally that is very similar to what we saw in California. And as our friend from Texas, who's actively engaged in this effort, said earlier correctly, if Texas goes blue, I think it basically breaks the back of the Republican Party nationally. And I'm not sure it recovers for at least a generation, probably longer. The reason is because the Republican Party has adopted a white grievance identity politics. And it's very hard. It's really speaking to one small shrinking demographic consciously, loudly, and it's doubling down on this cul-de-sac, this dead end. And so how you actually perform outreach in that environment, I think, is very, very problematic. What I will say is I think that the Democratic Party will change a lot more in the near term, or maybe the medium term, than the Republican Party will. I don't see the Republican Party evolving. I don't see it adapting. I don't see it actually growing beyond its shrinking white base. I think that leaves everybody else to the Democratic Party, which at a certain point becomes sort of unsustainable, and kind of the real policy differences that we're going to be addressing, as we clearly do in California now, will happen with different gradations of Democrats, and what the Democrats decide are the priorities for us as Californians to figure out.
Go ahead, Laura.
I would just like to comment a little bit about this, because I'm really fascinated by this idea, like, how do we move forward in terms of organizing our community, and sort of just to sort of pull the curtain back behind, the consulting world, is that, the consulting world drives a lot of how campaigns are done. He's sending people out block walking, knocking and dragging, and informing to make money. You make money by doing the big TV buys, doing the big digital buys. So, organizing is hard, back-breaking work that you don't make a lot of money off of. And so going to Christina's point, that's the work that needs to get done. That's not the work where money is made. So that I've always felt that has always been the problem within, our structural system of the way we do our politics. And until we can figure out how a way to make money on field, like real money, we'll continue to be moving everything towards television and media. And that really is not how you create and build a strong foundation for future generations of Latinos.
Well, what an incredible conversation we've had today. We're going to turn to Councilmember Eric here in just a moment, who is who knows the message that Laura just gave about turning campaigning upside down and away from an industry and into into empowerment is exactly the life that the Councilmember here has left. But I really want to thank all three of our incredible panelists for their insight, for their lessons, for their passion. And also to the Center for California Studies and the partners of the center, Leonore Elling, who will join us in just a moment again, for assembling such an extraordinary group that has brought to us today tactics, strategy, scholarship, questions, answers, an imperative. So, Councilmember Guerra, please let's turn it over to you for some closing comments.
Well, first I want to thank the university here. Thank you. I get to call you Professor Christopher Cabaldon, and friend, alma mater, and thank you also, Mr. Mayor, for moderating this great panel. Thank you very much, Dr. Cristina Flores Victor, and Mike Madrid, who I've gotten a chance to know over the last almost 20 years now, starting off as a young staffer in politics. And good to see you, Laura. Again, it's good to see that you're out here and connecting with us. Keep up the good work on the other side of the Rockies there. I think one of the things that I'd like to close off with, and it is true, it's about the engagement of the Latino voter, because the benefit that I saw when I ran for city council was that we had an early and aggressive, specific Latino voter outreach strategy. And for the long time, we've talked about the sleeping giant. And why are things different now? And I think that our panelists here brought a great culmination of a lot of those factors. Number one, the stakes are higher. Number one, they're higher. And why will there be a bigger turnout? It's not because of the campaigns. It's actually because, despite the traditional political campaigns, their lack of commitment to the Latino community has created a self-fulfilling prophecy of lower voter turnout. We know that campaigns have limited resources, and traditionally they've always spent them on the single-family homeowner, the suburban voter, the high-propensity voter, which, if we look at the demographics, have normally traditionally been white homeowners. And so we create into this, we've fallen into this tactic where the no money goes out into Latino communities, whether they be recent immigrant, recent naturalized citizens, or third or fourth generation Latino voters, and they're less engaged, they're getting less information, so there's less dialogue, there's less opportunity for disagreement to create more of that Thanksgiving political conversation at the dinner table, and so you have less engagement. So there's no surprise that that's been our history, but despite that, we do see a lot of more engagement this time because the stakes are higher. The threat to the community and the flagrant, obviously offensive attacks on the Latino people has engaged more of the Latinx community. So one, I want to thank Mike Madrid for the focus on the Lincoln Project, as you mentioned, to go into those specific communities and remind Latino voters of the dangers of the Trump administration. I think that's going to be a critical one. Second, Latinos live in a mixed status family, as you heard Dr. Flores Victor mention. So immigration has been and always will be a factor because it is a close experience and important to family preservation. And so but it doesn't rank always number one. The stakes are higher this time around because the economic loss and health tragedy of COVID-19 are higher. And not only that, but I believe also the impacts are much more visible. And let me point out something, that the political and social barriers to opportunity is something that is very insulting to the Latinx community. Latinos who value work ethic, the term ganas is a critical term. My dad had a much more crude term that started with the che as for the term ganas. But that pride of work ethic and the lack of or acknowledgement of Latinos for their work is offensive. Not acknowledging them as first responders, not funding opportunities that create opportunity, like education. That's why it's a big factor, like employment opportunities, or the ability to be entrepreneurs. Those are priorities that Latinos are seeing are being pulled away. And this president, those who have followed his rhetoric, I believe, have not only attempted to restrict resources, but also failed to act to provide those economic resources. So if we're to ensure, I believe, what we've heard all in this conversation, if we're to ensure that we're going to bring Latino voters up, those in political institutions, and I'm talking the campaigns, the political parties, even the universities who do education, need to spend the resources to engage Latinos now. And we know once we've created a culture of voting, there's a lot of data that I'm sure Dr. Flores Victor could bring out to this, that once we create a culture of voting, that has generational, multi-generational returns on engaged citizenry and engaged voters that will bring up those Latinos. So I think, to close off, to say thank you to Sac State, Stingers up, go Hornets. I can see a change here for the Latino community, and I appreciate the conversation. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for joining us. And back to you, Leonor, the head of the Center for California Studies, for a final word.
Thank you very much to Mr. Mayor, all of our distinguished panelists, for our participants. Mil gracias. Also, thank you to Rossi Hernandez, Phil Garcia, Hassan, Mal Almeida. And we've recorded this event. We'll have it on our website shortly. Thank you very much.
Have a great day. Thank you for joining us.
Don't forget to vote.